This is the S2G podcast. I'm Tanya Backritzes. In this episode, we're going on a cross-sector deep dive into the current state and future of protein with S2G's Matt Walker and Larsen Mettler. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal, business, tax, or investment advice, nor should it be used to evaluate any investment or security. It is not directed at or intended for any current or prospective investor in any investment vehicle sponsored by S2G. Investing involves risk, including the potential loss of capital. References to specific companies are for illustrative and educational purposes only and do not represent an endorsement or investment recommendation. The views expressed by podcast guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of S2G. For additional important information, please visit s2ginvestments.com/disclosures.
We are seeing overall protein really be attractive to S2G and other investors because it intersects across human nutrition, animal health, and climate impact.
In our first The Seam Style episode of this season, S2G Managing Directors Matt Walker from our Food and Agriculture team and Larsen Mettler from our Oceans team joined Chuck Templeton to tackle one of the most critical and fast-evolving pressure points in our global food system, protein. Protein isn't just the ribeye steak or salmon fillet on your plate. It sits at the center of some of the most pressing challenges facing our food system today, from climate change to resource use, nutrition, and consumer demand. How we produce it will define not only the future of food, but also of our economies and the environment. In this conversation, Matt, Larsen, and Chuck explore how the protein industry is being reshaped by shifting diets, supply chain stressors, and breakthrough technologies. They also dig into some of the most exciting opportunities across land-based, aquatic, plant-based, and cultivated protein, from feed solutions to hybrid products, and offer a glimpse into where value is likely to be created and how the future of the sector is taking shape.
I'm super excited to be here today with Larsen Mettler and Matt Walker, two of our managing directors, in a cross-sector lens at protein. So it's going to be a good conversation. If you both could quickly introduce yourself and describe your roles here at S2G.
Yeah, thank you, Chuck. Excited to do this. Matt, I'm excited to be here with you. My name's Larsen. I am a managing director with S2G's Oceans team, and we have been investing across animal health, human health, and climate for the oceans in late-stage venture and growth equity. We currently have about 20 investments in the space and looking to deploy more capital.
Hi, I'm Matt Walker. I'm a managing director on the food and ag team here at S2G. I'm in my 11th year investing in the space, all with S2G, now across venture and growth stage with investments in a bit over 70 companies across the supply chain.
Matt, talk a little bit about protein as a core sector for S2G and how we see this at the seams opportunity between the work you're doing and the work that Larsen and the Oceans team is doing. How do we think about protein in a food and ag setting?
Yeah, in terms of it being a core sector, it's not necessarily about it being a core growth sector, at least in the US. Meat and dairy production are just a very large part of the food system. And so as we focus on food and agriculture, as much as 75 to 80% of agricultural land is dedicated to livestock production. That's grading and feed production. And if you look at it on a dollar basis, it's difficult to know because we spend I think most of our money now on out-of-home eating, but it could be in the neighborhood of 10 to 20% of our spending on food is on meat itself. Meat is just a core part of our food system. Obviously, it has a significant impact on our environment as well. 14% of greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, come from livestock. That's to say nothing of the impacts on water use, biodiversity, and the like. So it just is such a large portion of the food system. And that's one of the reasons why we certainly pay attention to it.
So Larsen, what makes protein a core focus area for S2G?
Yeah, so we are seeing overall protein really be attractive to S2G and other investors because it intersects across human nutrition, animal health, and climate impact. So I'll speak to the seafood component, but in 2023, the global seafood market was valued at over $359 billion. that is projected to grow over the next 10 years at a CAGR of 11%. And the aquaculture segment alone is growing significantly from about 312 billion up to 573 billion. So these are big numbers, and we're seeing a global population growth and middle class expansion across several continents. And then from a valuation standpoint, there's very attractive companies that are here that are flying under the radar. From the seafood side, especially in aquaculture and vertically integrated operations, we're seeing EBITDA multiples trade at kind of 12 to 16x in the public markets, but a large portion of that industry remains privately held, particularly those that are among production assets like fish farms, hatcheries, processors, and they're owned by aging ownership groups with limited investment modernization and few alternatives of succession plans. So when we're seeing the exit and public markets trading at 12 to 16x, the assets for these that are coming out of those private transactions frequently traded somewhere between 5 to 7 times. So it's a really compelling entry point for investors to deploy capital in what we're seeing is a gray to green strategy. And then we're able to go in and upgrade these legacy operations with technology, automation, animal health tools, and ESG aligned practices to enhance productivity and reduce environmental impact.
Excellent. So I wanted to start with the problem. Protein is obviously fast growing food sector with 70% projected increase over the next sort of 25 years or so. Can you talk about the rising protein demand in your sectors and talk about some of the key drivers?
Absolutely, Chuck. I think there's some key statistics to point out when we think about seafood. And the first is really thinking about the scale. And as we see the worldwide demand growing for protein, we see that seafood playing a critical role in meeting that demand. Today, over 3.3 billion people rely on it as their primary source of animal protein. And that's over 50% in some smaller coastal and island communities. Globally, seafood accounts for about 17% of animal protein intake and over 20% low income and food deficit countries.
One thing I just want to note is I think when we're talking about protein here, we really mean meat in most cases. And I think today we're talking about meat and a bit about plant-based meat, but obviously there's another sizable market for other forms of protein that aren't meat substitutes per se, like beans and nuts, for example. As it relates to demand growth, I think it's important to put the time horizon and drivers in context. And I think generally in the land-based context, globally, we expect to see demand for meat or consumption of meat continue to increase because we expect the global population to increase and the portion of the population that can afford to eat meat to increase, which is a good thing. In the United States specifically, we actually expect relatively flat to slight increases in consumption of meat. And that is mostly the story of poultry. And for a variety of supply and demand-based reasons, we expect beef to remain flat, perhaps, for the next few years, and pork to remain flat to perhaps slightly down on a continuing trend. And so in the US, it's a fairly mature market. I don't think that we're talking about as much of a demographic tailwind, but we do see a shift toward poultry consumption. And we think that shift will be greater than perhaps the declines that we might see in other meats. Slight growth in the US. Globally, it's a story of population increase and a larger number of people that can afford to eat meat, combined with a variety of different methods of being able to produce that meat.
So beyond rising demand, there are supply side pressures as well. And so obviously that's a lot of what we think about here at S2G. And so how would you describe the protein production and supply chains today in your sectors?
I think there's a couple key areas that we look at. Supply chains in seafood are very complex and they're under mounting pressure. They're coming from a convergence of that rising demand, geopolitical shifts and the diversity of where that seafood is produced, environmental stressors, and then long-standing structural inefficiencies within the cold chain. As we talked about, seafood is one of the most traded food commodities, and actually 38% of that crosses international borders. So that interdependence really makes it vulnerable to external shocks. So we saw this in COVID, and we're recently seeing it in things like tariffs today, right? That balance of power is shifting every day. And it's difficult to balance pricing and have stability in supply and pricing when you have that steady kind of rise in market demand. Compounding those challenges is that concentration of where the production is coming from. 10 countries across the world account for over 70% of global seafood. China alone accounts for more than 35% of aquaculture output. The wild captures is also similarly concentrated. This really heightens exposure, not just to political issues like tariffs and things like that, but also disease outbreaks and climate impact that can really have outside effects on global supply. And when we think about climate impacts, these environmental constraints are also beginning to restrict production. As we see warming oceans continue to increase at a rapid pace, it's driving fish migrations, it's disrupting spawning grounds, it's increasing the frequency of harmful algal blooms. And in aquaculture, we're seeing climate change is amplifying biological threats like sea lice, especially in salmon farming, while the availability and cost of sustainable feed ingredients like fish meal, soy, and algae remain persistent bottlenecks in scaling. These stressors threaten to slow the output, but demand is still set to rise by 70% by 2050. The last thing that I'll mention is the infrastructure gaps. And when we look at that, it's the cold chain. There's too much to dive into with all the ports and the shipping, but from a U.S. perspective, which is a large importer of seafood, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit later as well, but we have cold storage vacancy rates of 2 to 4%. And that really reflects a strained and aging network. And a lot of these developing nations don't have a cold chain capacity at all. So what happens is there's a lot of seafood that's not getting put into cold storage or into the cold chain. And we're seeing post-harvest losses of up to 30%. You've got some supply restriction, and we've got exacerbated food security by a lot of this.
In beef, you still have strong demand for beef generally, but beef production has quite a few supply side pressures, and we're seeing cooling growth. There's actually a historic decline in herd sizes in the United States, the smallest since maybe the 1950s. And if you think about less supply, that in part leads to higher prices. There have also been just changes in dietary preferences. People were eating 90, 100 pounds of beef per year in the 70s, and they're eating maybe 2/3 of that today. At the same time, you've had your environmental pressures. Droughts and problems in the soil have resulted in reduced grazing capacity of certain land in certain markets. We've also had certain policy shifts leading to restrictions on grazing land and on production in feed. You also have inflation that hits both feed and labor costs. And so what you have is a situation where you have increasing costs, fewer animals, and all of those things lead to lower supply, and they might, in some cases, lead to lower demand, as you see that price for beef has climbed significantly. On the poultry side, obviously, we've seen typically with layers, as they are older birds, we've seen issues with influenza and culling of large numbers of birds. But I think on a high level, on a macro basis, this is a market that, in terms of feed conversion ratios, in terms of price to produce a pound of meat, it's a very efficient market. And in many cases is the first meat or the most affordable meat that a person can buy. This is a market that is perhaps better able to absorb some of the input price fluctuations that you see in commodity cycles, given the conversion ratios. And I think we expect to see continued growth in the future in this market.
And so how are the world's major protein producers responding to these challenges? These are some big, challenging issues that you're seeing in protein. It's a global product, right? How are they responding? How is the seafood world responding?
Yeah. As we mentioned, climate change is among one of the most pressing and big issues around shifting marine ecosystems and seafood production. As it intensifies, we are seeing many of these producers look to different areas around technology and production. For example, I think that when we look at rising water temperatures in Chile and Norway around salmon farming, we are seeing companies, because of these oxygen deprivation levels, go and invest into mechanical oxygenation systems like diffused aeration, liquid oxygen injection, deep water intakes, and they're changing systems around where they're farming fish in the water column. We're seeing other areas that are being countered as well. So overfishing has been a major concern. What we're seeing there is MPAs being put together, and MPAs are showing benefits around total value of catch for fishermen while it's protecting the ecosystems. We're also seeing investments into becoming more efficient as a whole from a feed and production levels. We're seeing companies invest in technology, like companies like Real Data that are optimizing feed and reducing waste, which lowers the overall cost of production. We're also seeing new companies emerge with new technologies that are an offset that don't harm the ocean, such as algal proteins, and whether that's a meal and oil product that's going and being fed back to fish, or that's a meal and oil product that is going into human grade nutrition. So there's a big, wide variety of how this is being handled.
Obviously, animals have to eat to actually gain the weight and build the protein, and you need inputs for cultivated meat as well. And so, Larsen, maybe let's start with you on the aquaculture standpoint. Like, what types of systems or technology is emerging that helps feed these animals? And can we maybe explain how currently a lot of the fish have been fed, or those calories have come from, and where the opportunities are in the future?
Yeah. So from the feed side, obviously we're talking about aquaculture and not wild. And this has really been at the heart of the sustainability challenge for a while. And it's a major opportunity for investors and the industry as a whole. Today, 80% of global soy and 33% of global grain production is diverted into animal feed. And aquaculture was part of that category that relies heavily on those, plus wild caught fish meal. I think when we look at fishing wild harvests, about 30 to 35% of all wild harvests are going to feed aquaculture production. So as we're seeing aquaculture production continue to increase, it's an area where we're going to see limits on the wild stock. We're going to see pressures on wild stock, and it's clear that we need innovation there. We're seeing innovation across several areas, and I'll highlight some companies that we're quite familiar with. We have a company that we think is very attractive called Mara Renewables. We recently did an announcement on them, and I'd encourage people to go read that article. But they're doing a large-scale production of algal-based omega-3s that emulate that traditional fish and meal oil and reduce pressure on an overfished forage fish. That's one example. We're seeing other innovations and sustainability efforts. Here in the US, we have a company called Aquatic Protein, and Aquatic Protein is taking the challenge on of battling invasive carp. And it's been a huge biomass that has been consuming algal areas and smaller fish that have depleted the other fisheries that are in the waterways and the other threatening the Great Lakes as well. Aquatic Protein is removing those carp, and they're turning them into nutrient-rich feed that are going back into fish feed. So these are invasive species that are damaging the ecosystem, and they're taking them out and putting them to good use. They're also doing that with a zero discharge processing system, which is novel in the sector. We're also seeing many companies in the insect category. We support a company called Enthos Circular Technologies, and they're upcycling byproducts like vegetable trimmings and brewery waste into fully traceable, low-impact feed ingredients by feeding that waste to black soldier flies and then converting that into meal, oil, and fertilizer. Some really exciting companies and really exciting tech is out there, and that we think that these feed innovations are being paired up with some of these other mechanical systems that we've talked about, right? There's the pure play on, hey, let's go replace the feed, meal, and oil. But then there is also the execution on reducing the feed overall. So when you take some of these options and then pair them with precision tools like Real Data's AI feeding optimization or oxygenation systems from companies like Moliere, we're really creating a new class of aquaculture that's resource efficient, nutritionally robust, and circular by design. So I'm very excited about those.
So Matt, what emerging feed solutions are you seeing that can help reduce resource intensity and make sure these animals are getting the nutrition they need? What are some of the things you're seeing that's interesting out there?
There's a few angles there. One of them, as you mentioned, is in feed. I think we look at yield, we look at resilience, and we look at profitability. But a lot of it is not losing what's being produced. And so there are pest control solutions that we're invested in to make sure that what the farmer is attempting to produce can actually make it to the animal. Also, breeding solutions, and they might be about creating higher protein content in soy, for instance. We're in a couple of businesses that are focused on that, where for what you're producing in an acre, for the same amount of soy, you might have a higher portion of protein in that soy. And then you use that in your feed regimen. And you can either increase the affordability or produce more for the same amount. Other breeding aimed at things like drought resistance, because one of the things that we're seeing is that certain land is less suitable than it was previously for production. And how do we overcome that? Those are some of the buckets that we look at on the feed side. But I would have to say, of the intensive meat production that is done, is actually quite efficient, financially speaking, in terms of the ability to turn feed into meat. And it's particularly in the case of poultry. And I think it's good to see greater growth in poultry consumption and indicative of a shift toward greater consumption of poultry over some of the other meats.
So, Matt, Larsen, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about sort of non-meat protein. So whether that's plant-based or cultivated, tell us a little bit about what you're seeing and how the industry is changing and what's working and what's not. Matt, maybe you can start.
In the alt protein space, over the past decade, we saw a large run-up in enthusiasm and in distribution and production of that next wave of plant-based meats. And one of the things that ended up happening was it seemed like a lot of purchasers were experimenting. So they purchased something once and weren't necessarily repeat purchasers for, I think, a variety of reasons that we can get into. And a lot of the growth that we saw for some of these companies was distribution, adding new doors, new outlets, new places to sell the product, but not necessarily finding that customer that wanted to make their plant-based product a core part of their diet or their shopping basket. And we think that's for a variety of reasons, and they all boil down to the product not necessarily performing as well as the real thing. The other thing, it was a very expensive product, and I think the consumer didn't perceive a lot of that product as particularly nutritious because long ingredient labels. And so I think what we've seen is an approach that is leaning toward cleaner or shorter, let's say, ingredient stacks for these products. In fact, one of the things that we're seeing in the plant-based meat space is for plant burgers and the like, actual plant burgers that are using things like beans and grains and not designed to actually mimic or be perceived as beef. Those companies I think they found their niche in their customer base and they're enjoying some growth. We've seen less for those companies that are actually trying to replace meat with a plant-based ingredient stack. On the cell-based side, I think there's a lot of room for excitement and enthusiasm there. We've seen 5 or 6 companies now get their approval from the FDA. Several have an approval from USDA as well, and that allows them to actually produce and sell a cell-based product. We're not really there yet today. I think in the coming year or so, we'll start to see some of those products come to market. And I think the promise there is that this is real meat. So you should have that taste and mouthfeel, and you should have a product that is equally performant as real meat in the market. And so the question there is, do you have an affordable product? Is it in convenient form factors? Is the nutrition on par or perhaps superior to what you would get from animal-based meat? And we do see some real environmental differentiation there. But again, I think that is probably a secondary consideration for most consumers.
And we have some good news for a couple of our portfolio companies, one Wild Type, the other Believer Meats. So Larsen, maybe if you could comment on Wild Type's recent news. It's exciting for the whole industry.
Yeah, absolutely. When we think about it, alternative proteins, both plant-based and cultivated, are beginning to find their place in the future of seafood. Companies like you mentioned, Wild Type, have really gotten a lot of momentum right now. So they've received FDA clearance for their cultivated salmon. It's a regulatory milestone, and that product's now being served in U.S. restaurants. That is something where you theoretically in the future could produce as much pounds of seafood as you want using these systems, right? And you could completely leave the ocean out of it. These companies are offering really compelling benefits, right? Real seafood without antibiotics, no mercury, no microplastics, and a significantly reduced environmental footprint. They still do face a lot of challenges. First and foremost are regulatory barriers. Only a few jurisdictions like the US and Singapore have approved the production and consumption at a commercial scale, but they're still pretty high cost, right? Especially at pilot scales. I think that the cost needs to come down, certainly. The flavor in my mind today is there, as well as the texture and look. There are some interesting components that still need to be overcome, though, particularly around the preparation. So what I've seen in cultivated seafood so far is it's a great fresh product and a great sashimi product. I've not seen a product yet that can be cooked well and baked in a traditional manner. They can be seared, but there is still an issue around traditional preparation that I think a lot of people have outside of sushi products. And then I think at the other end of the spectrum, we're going to see how large-scale adoption across different generational demographics are going to accept this. Our younger consumers, Gen Z and millennials, going to adapt it, who are open to more food tech and sustainability narratives. Our older generation's going to accept it. Time's going to tell, right? But we do think that these type of proteins, they won't replace conventional seafood in the near term, but they will contribute to a more diverse, climate-aligned protein system. And their success will really depend on continued innovation, affordability, and the ability to build trust among different consumer segments.
It also, from a sovereign standpoint, it gives countries a potential choice to bring in other food sources that can help with their population growth and other things like that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing, landlocked countries that do not traditionally have access to seafood invest in these technologies. And from a perspective of GHG footprint, water use, energy to feed ratios, these are very attractive alternatives.
Yeah. And Matt, do you see the concept of sort of a hybrid product or a mixed product? You got your plant-based substrate that's actually mixed in with either cultivated meat or some other meat that maybe helps the consumer along that path, or do you think it'll jump straight to 100% cultivated meat?
I think it's technology specific, but just given the affordability, the cell-based component is going to be the most expensive component. And in the case of beef and ground beef, I think a lot of these will be the further processed varieties that you see in market. I don't think we're going to see a cell-based porterhouse at scale anytime soon. And like a lot of the meat that we eat, it's further processed. It's ground. It's made into things like nuggets or strips and the like. In those cases, you've got perhaps 80% protein or muscle tissue rather, and then 20% fat tissue. And often the key differentiator here would be the fat tissue. So you might see a product that has only 20% inclusion rate that is using a cell-based fat and uses some plant-based material for the muscle tissue in a ground product. That should be a less expensive product. I do think eventually we will see, and we've seen and invested in technologies that should provide for that 100% cell-based product. But I think in initial years, you would see a hybrid product as being significantly more affordable and providing the experience, because I do think fat is the differentiator in that case of a ground product.
Yeah, it gives so much of that flavor and mouthfeel and just the sensation of being satiated and whatnot is that fat piece that a lot of people are looking for when they go to meat.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that has been missing from some of the plant-based products. And so if you can actually augment with real fat, I think that can be pretty powerful. And I do expect to see that hybrid product being the first product that starts to scale in market.
Definitely. Yeah, that experience piece for consumers is going to be so critical.
I think the best products are those for which the consumer that isn't there because of the environmental impact is still buying the product. And I think those are the products that have the best chance at scaling in the market.
Yeah, that and supply chain surety, right?
Absolutely.
Parts of the world that want to right now depend on imports as a big piece of their protein production could potentially set up a cell-based shop locally.
And you make a good point, because I think with protein and meat in general, there are so many different products and many different methods of production and reasons for different products and different methods. And I think for those that have the capital for the infrastructure, and in particular those that have low energy costs and that don't have themselves that bounty of ranch land in domestic production, cell-based has a place.
Yeah.
And there's a real opportunity to produce your own meat at scale locally. There's potential for it to be meat without certain adulterants as well. and to be tailor-made for certain types of production and other supply chain considerations. And so there is a lot of value there. We've got to get this stuff to market. And I think we're excited to see some of that starting to happen with these approvals in the US.
We look at the lens of both mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And from an adaptation framework to protein, designing systems that are resilient to climate variability, political shifts or geopolitical shifts, and other drivers of volatility, where's the future for a lot of these providers and innovators that are out there?
Yeah, I'll start with kind of the aquaculture side. I think that when you look at the sustainability aspect and sustainability lens around growth, really efforts in genetic selection and breeding are helping improve disease resistance, growth rates, and feed efficiency. We're seeing a lot of investment as well in technology that supports healthy and resilient ecosystems. So we talked about a little bit earlier, but oxygenation is a cost savings to producers because it grows healthier fish faster and reduces your feed costs. It's also a benefit to the environment because you're not having as much leftover waste falling down and polluting the surrounding areas. It's really around those, I think, on the aquaculture side. I think we're also seeing a lot around the cold chain and logistics side. So we mentioned some 30 to 35% post-loss harvest earlier. That's really due to inadequate refrigeration delays and infrastructure failures. So we're looking to a number of investments there that have continued to improve biosecurity and invest in a more resilient infrastructure that will reduce those losses.
We're about investing at the seams. And so what are some cross-sector learnings or insights that you might have or that might have formed your thesis around sustainable protein production?
Yeah, I think that some of the cross-sector insights that we've seen have really been focused around sustainable protein production, focused on resilience, circularity, and technological adaptation. And that's not only seafood, but it's livestock and alternative proteins. I think that a major thing that we've been paying attention to is genetic improvement and precision health. This has long been proven in livestock, and now it's actively being applied to seafood. In terrestrial animal agriculture, they have decades of selective breeding that have improved these feed conversion or FCR ratios, growth rates, and disease resistance. That's now just coming to light, and the data is being collected in seafood and aquaculture. And we're even seeing companies that are doing very similar things across the sectors, right? And we're starting to see collaboration among those as well. We look at companies like Real Data and IUNU. They're doing very similar things. IUNU is doing it more on plants versus protein, but camera systems that are very focused in a similar way, collecting data and analyzing them and using AI. I think that is one area that we found to be very interesting. I think the other one is feed innovation. So poultry and swine, we've seen alternative proteins like insect meal, microbial proteins, and fermentation being used for a while, and they've been reducing their impact on soy and fish meal. And again, now these are being adapted for aquaculture feeds to really driving a shared agenda across lower input, reduced volatility, lower land use, better emissions. So I think that's exciting. And then we are seeing a bunch of really important lessons from the alternative protein sector in terms of consumer engagement, regulatory issues, clean label formation that are really informing cross-sector collaboration here. We talked about wild type earlier and their path to FDA approval. While wild type gets FDA approval as a seafood component and terrestrial proteins are getting USDA approval is interesting, but they're getting together and uniting to get approval across the country in the US and worldwide, and certainly supporting each other's efforts. So I think it's been a big community effort there. I also think that one area that has been a cross-sector learning and still catching on is full product utilization and circularity. You think about beef, pork, and chicken, nothing is wasted coming out of those. Yeah, maybe you have some sludge or something like that isn't too suitable or interesting to talk about on a podcast, but it's thinking about how you're getting the most value creation out of an animal that you're harvesting here. So that's really looking today at some of the seafood applications. So this has been a industry in the past that has wasted on average 40 to 50% of every fish that's been caught. And when you start using those and repurposing them into high value outputs, it not only creates economic resilience, but also environmental efficiencies that cuts across all protein sectors. And I think that the more we have this cross-sector collaboration, it creates a more resilient protein system, and they should be borrowing, adapting, and integrating innovations across the supply chain.
And Matt, I guess, so what might the future protein production system look like?
I think we'll see a mosaic. I think there's an all of the above that I would expect to see in the future. I think traditional production methods and traditional meat will certainly have a very large role in the future. And I think there are certain dining scenarios and use cases, if you will, where people are going to want and prefer that traditional product that is produced, perhaps even moving more toward heirloom or regenerative practices. Because I think if you want to sit down for a steak dinner, you might want to hear the story of how the meat is being produced. And that is a dining occasion where I think people might, in the long term, have a preference for the traditional production method of meat. I also think in the future, we will see more controlled environment production, cell based. And that is, as you mentioned earlier, hybrid products that use plant based and cell based, and perhaps certainly certain 100% plant based product and likely some 100% cell based product in certain cases. And if you think about it, most of the meat that we eat is meat. We're not usually eating a steak. We're eating ground products. We're eating further processed products. I think we will see more and more of that being produced with some of these novel methods, which in many cases are gentler on the environment. They may have nutritional differentiation. And I think in a global market, they can be produced in different places where we can't produce traditional meat in the way that we're doing it today. So I think you'll see some of that differentiation. I also think we're seeing it now. I think we're going to continue to see an increase in convenience meat.
This convenience meat, Matt.
Things like meat snacking.
Meat snacking, yeah.
And I think that because of things like GLP-1s, because of preference for protein, and the fact that meat offers that complete protein and bioavailability, and people enjoy it. People enjoy eating meat. I think we're going to see a lot of that further processed, your snacking, your sausages, your meatballs, your meat sticks and the like, and continued innovation in providing meat-based or meat including snacking products and convenience products as well. I think globally, you have certain markets where the constraints are different, and certain markets where the infrastructure cost isn't a problem, or the energy cost isn't a problem, or where the price per pound may be higher, but for certain SKUs and certain types of meat, there simply will be demand at sufficient scale. And I think in the global market, we're just going to see multiple types of production, including hybrid product, cell-based product, and plant-based.
Yeah, lots of opportunity for entrepreneurs and innovators. It's a lot of work. Awesome. So, Larsen, what might the future protein production system look like?
Yeah, I think there's two chunks of time period that I'm looking at. It's kind of the next 10 years and the next 30 years. So I think in the next 10 years, we're going to start seeing protein production systems look more localized. They're going to be more data driven and diversified. So moving away from the high volume commodity dominated models that we've seen today in today's food system. In seafood, that means an expanded use of climate resilient aquaculture that includes offshore farms, land-based systems that have real-time environmental monitoring and are closer to their customers. So they'll have a lower footprint there. I think we're seeing companies that are increasingly using things that are efficient that they weren't before because of potential consumer perception around genetics, vaccines, oxygenation systems that are really helping out in reducing losses and improving yield. Alternative feed inputs will continue to grow. I think that they haven't become mainstream just because it's on the front end of it, and they haven't been able to produce the large, consistent volumes that are needed to be the core components like wild-caught fish meal and soy are. And I think that nearshore and smallhold fisheries will continue to play a vital role there in developing nations. They will need to have stronger traceability and market access and cold chains there. In that kind of second group of timing, I think that we're going to see the protein system be regenerative, circular, and really integrated with climate adaptation goals, and that will be driven a lot by the consumer. There's going to be further integration between the sectors, not only across the protein sectors. I think we'll continue to see integration in seafood across species and across countries as well. I think that full product utilization will be, if not required, standard practice, and that we will see cultivated and precision fermented proteins accounting for a large share of that protein mix, especially in urban centers and institutional settings. When we think about a lot of these technologies, they're novel today, but they're moving more towards a utility view, and they'll support food security without land expansion or marine extraction. Quite a bit to be excited about, and there's going to be quite a bit of change in my mind that are really focusing on environmental outcomes, animal health, and human health. And it'll be a major departure from today's fragmented efficiency first model.
Yeah, and it's just these massive industries that will be changing fairly rapidly, considering they've taken 100 years or 150 years to get to this point. I think the amount of change over the next 10 to 15 years is going to be even bigger than over the last 100 years, if you will.
Yeah, I think it has to be, right? This change in climate is not linear. It's exponential, and it's growing at a scary pace. So these are real issues that need to be solved very quickly. And I think that we have a lot of companies and entrepreneurs that are stepping up to the plate to do that.
Yeah, it's great stuff. A lot of exciting things. Larsen, Matt, thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it. It was great to connect. And obviously, we're excited by the work that you're both doing here at S2G and looking forward to seeing where this all goes.
Thank you for tuning in to the S2G podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review, or share it with a friend. For more information or to connect with us, check out s2ginvestments.com.